just because you don't hear much from Japan or APAC countries, colleagues from those countries, it does not mean that they have no opinions or they agree with you completely. It means that there is not enough psychological safety for them to share their real opinions.
Hi, this is Anna Kostetska. Welcome to What Works Across Cultures, my podcast on the art and science of global leadership and teamwork. I've explored this topic for over 15 years. Now I'm bringing experts from all around the world to talk about how culture shapes the way we lead, communicate, and collaborate. And of course, what works across cultures. Join our conversation. Welcome. In this episode, we'll talk about psychological safety and how culture impacts it. As always, I have a small disclaimer for you. We are going to be talking about cultural differences, and these are the patterns in how people tend to behave and how they also interpret the behavior of others. And just to be clear, that does not mean that everyone will act in the same way. People are complex, and culture is only one of many things that shape how we think and behave at work and beyond. Today, I invited Keiko Sakurai, Director of Consulting at Aperion, who's based in Kobe, Japan. Keiko, you have over 20 years of experience in team building, organizational development, executive coaching, and leadership development for multinational companies. And you regularly help European, North American, and Asian Pacific, APAC teams collaborate more effectively. So I'm really happy to be having this conversation today with you. And I'll start by just inviting you to add anything to the introductions you would want the listeners to know.
Sure. Thank you, Anna, for introducing me. So I am Japanese, born in Japan. I was born in Tokyo, but I also lived in Thailand and Germany during my childhood. And I also lived and worked in the US for the past 20 years. So I have lots of experience working outside of Japan. And then I moved back to Japan in 2023. So having lived in multiple countries since childhood, your podcast theme of what works across cultures has been critical for me both personally and professionally. So I'm very happy to be invited to your podcast here.
Wonderful. So you have a lot of intercultural experience privately and also professionally.
Yes. And in terms of professionally, I have this kind of a unique background. Unlike other consultants, other colleagues who majored intercultural communications or psychology, I actually majored accounting and started my career as a CPA in one of the global accounting firms. Then actually I went on to investment banking, being a financial analyst. And I was not very happy in those companies. So I made a big career transition from CPA, financial analyst, to a cross-cultural consultant about 20 years ago after I graduated from the MBA program. So I was thinking about my past career and why I wanted to leave those careers and become, what I do right now. And I realized that lack of psychological safety in those workplaces was one of the major reasons. I did not enjoy working and I had low engagement because I didn't feel that my opinion mattered or even welcomed. So, psychological safety is a critical factor for me personally, and also it's a critical factor in employee engagement and team performance. So I look forward to exchanging our viewpoints on this and exploring the practical tips on building psychological safety in global teams.
Wonderful. So you're a perfect person to have this conversation. And it's a really interesting also career change that you have made. So let's start maybe with the definition. And I will use the definition of Amy Edmondson. And she talks about psychological safety as this shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for taking interpersonal risks. So asking questions, admitting mistakes, sharing ideas. Keiko, my first question to you is, how do you approach building psychological safety in your work with global teams?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. We also use the same definition that you explained. And having psychological safety or building psychological safety in my work with global teams is really critical for my work to be successful because I often facilitate global team building sessions where the team members come from North America, Europe, and APAC, including Japan, where I'm based. And these members often experience challenges in collaborating with different regions due to different work styles, different expectations, different priorities, communication issues, etc., which all lead to lack of trust and unproductive conflicts. And then they will, call me in to fix them. So I facilitate sessions where these members openly share the difficulties working with one another and explore solutions. And the key is that they openly share the difficulties, which, psychological safety is really critical for that to happen. If there's no psychological safety, they will only share superficial experience and opinions, which does not lead to real solutions. So, I will share with you what I do in a practical way. But one of the key things is that I not only explain the concept of psychological safety and the importance of it, but I also try to demonstrate the actual behaviors that would cultivate psychological safety in those team sessions. So the team members can see what I do, and they can probably implement some of the behaviors I demonstrate when they facilitate their own interactions in their teams.
Mm-hmm. What a great way to role model, right? The behaviors. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the signs of teams that have high psychological safety?
Before I share with you, can I go into some of the actual things that I do? And I'll share with you, when I see those teams starting to have those kind of signs, I know, okay, my session is going in the right direction. So let me explain some of the things that I do to create psychological safety in the teams. For example, at the beginning, as one of the ground rules, I will explain global English and ask the native English speakers to speak global English. So, usually those team sessions are conducted in English. And I know that many global teams, English is the common language to be, used. So I try to encourage native English speakers like Americans or Canadians or British to speak global English, which is not an American English or British English. Global English is the English which is easily understood by non-native English speakers, such as speaking slowly, clearly, no slang or acronyms. Or if you speak in a big paragraph, you need to summarize your point, etc. So I explain that. And then when I notice that native English speakers speak too fast or they use slang, I will actually stop them and say, sorry, I could not understand what you just said. Could you please speak more slowly, or could you repeat what you just said? Could you please explain what, whatever XYZ means? I do that during the session I facilitate. And that sometimes surprise the native English speakers because they never got that kind of feedback from their Asian colleagues. And they realize how often they make those, kind of mistakes. So I do that repeatedly several times during the session. And I also hope that, like APAC or Japanese members who tend to, struggle with, English conversations can say, okay, I can always stop the conversation and ask clarification question like Keiko does. So that's one of the things I do, encourage the team members to speak global English and stop and correct them if it's not happening. So that's one thing I do.
I love that you role model this because it is difficult to ask someone to repeat something. Sometimes what I do is also I give the experience to the native speakers. So sometimes maybe as a warm-up activity, I give native speakers the specific instruction. I tell them to, every time they use a verb, to add a synonym of this verb and talk like that for 5 minutes. So they could talk about, I don't know, weekend or something like that. So every time they use a verb, they have to kind of repeat it with a synonym. And that's, so for example, every time I talk, speak, I'll have to must use additional verb. So this kind of slows down their talking and give them a bit of a simulation of how does it feel to be using a different language.
That's an interesting idea. I might implement that in the future workshop I conduct. Thank you for sharing this interesting idea.
And that usually helps, right? But I love also your way of modeling asking questions and normalizing it that, this is not our first language, so we need to make sure that we understand one another.
Yeah, the thing is, we all know conceptually like we need to speak slowly and, we need to consider non-native speakers, etc. But it's hard to do. It's hard to actually do it, especially when we are in a heated conversation. So yeah, like my, what I do, like modeling or your idea of asking them to kind of experience what it's like to speak the second language. I think it's a great way for them to actually experience and, really put the learning in their body.
Mm-hmm. And what are some other things that you do?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
you
sure.
also
I have
mentioned-
many tips.
I'm
Mhm.
sure. And also you mentioned that you're usually brought in when there is kind of a low
Mhm.
psychological safety, right? So I
Yeah,
think you have
yeah.
some work to do there.
Yeah, so one other things that I do, especially with the goal of having the team members feel enough psychological safety to share their real challenges, opinion, etc. What I do additionally is to kind of increase or expand the means of communication. So instead of just asking them to speak up during the meeting, I will also encourage them to share their opinions or questions in the chat. So, like I personally still feel challenged to interrupt and speak up when someone is speaking. There are people who prefer to communicate via chat. That way they don't have to interrupt the speaker. So I also encourage them, okay, please feel free to type your opinion and question in the chat. And that way, surprisingly, more input can come from people who are usually quiet, who usually don't speak up. So that's one. Allow multiple means of communication channels like chat. And I share meeting materials and agenda in advance so that non-native English speakers with more like a certainty-oriented style, which we'll talk about later, more risk-averse style, can prepare in advance. One of the hurdles that they feel is that I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want to embarrass myself. So if I send them materials and topics to think about in advance, they can prepare. So, the hurdle of like, I don't want to embarrass myself will be lowered. And that will encourage them to speak up more easily during the session. So that's another thing, share meeting materials and agenda in advance. I also incorporate small group discussions, then have them report out their opinions as a group. And that works very well with people who are more group oriented. And, we'll talk about that later, but I change style depending on what the cultural background of the participants are. One of the very important thing about psychological safety, and, you asked the question first about what's the sign of a team that has high psychological safety. One of the indicator is the airtime. Make sure that the airtime is equally distributed. If I see that many North Americans or native English speakers are taking most of the airtime, I know there's not enough psychological safety. So I try to facilitate so that we hear more from those other regions like APAC and Japan. And when I feel like the airtime is equally distributed, I feel like, okay, I have achieved some level of success in terms of building psychological safety so that both parties speak up equally or share opinions equally. So that's another thing I do. And for example, I will say, let's now hear from Japan group. I will actually say that out loud to make sure that I secure time for those quiet members to share their opinions.
I actually like that you say Japan group because it also, you ask members to kind of present the perspective from this particular region and not an individual, right? So sometimes I'm finding that, especially for team members that are group oriented, it's easier for them to contribute if they know that they have to contribute on the behalf of the group. Otherwise, this perspective is not going to be heard, as opposed to kind of Keiko or someone's particular individual perspective.
Yeah, very much so. And one thing which is important is that, psychological safety is not just about speaking up. It's about what you share, So I want them to share challenges and what didn't go well, like failure, so to speak. So I introduce the importance of failing or sharing mistakes and reframe it as learning. Are you allowed to fail? One of the things about psychological safety is you feel comfortable to share incomplete ideas. You're comfortable to share what went wrong because it's all a part of learning. Learning and failing are closely connected, and learning happens through experimentations, and experimentation often results in failure. So I would like people to take, kind of an interpersonal risk or take a risk to share incomplete ideas so that I encourage them to fail, which is a source of learning.
Great. And I love that you added this additional thing. So it's not only that we share, but we also share things that are not necessarily well thought. We share also challenges, maybe disagreements. And so then flipping the question, what should we be aware of? What are some signs of a team with a low psychological safety?
Yeah, so when I'm not doing my work, like to my highest quality, like when I'm doing the session, when I experience these signs, I have, like yellow flag, like I need to switch how I facilitate. So one is long silence especially from APAC members. If the company is headquartered in the US and Europe, it's only the headquarters members, either in US or Europe, speak, and long silence from APAC subsidiaries. When that happens, I know, I need to do something differently. Or only the members with senior positions speak, both from APAC side or the US and European side. Only the senior, management speak and the junior or younger members are silent. That's another sign that there's not enough psychological safety for them to share. Or nothing shared in chat. Or sometimes the very serious discussions, but no laughter or sense of humor. Some of the successful sessions I facilitated, there's a lot of laughters, interestingly. They can laugh at their own mistakes because it's a way to learn, and they embrace those mistakes that made by themselves or by their colleagues. There's a sense of humor and laughter in a warm setting, and that's a sign of high psychological safety. And the seriousness and the long silence, nothing shared in chat, that's a sign, which means there's a lack of psychological safety. And another thing is that I think that I shared already, but people speak up, but they only share agreement to what the senior management said, or they only share best practices or what went well. That's another sign that there's something wrong with the psychology. Like there's more that we can do in terms of building psychological safety, so they can actually share honestly what didn't go well.
Yeah. So it's kind of who's speaking and what is being shared and kind of what is the climate of the team. Because I think oftentimes we equate psychological safety with trust, but psychological safety is actually on a team level, right? So it's the climate of the team, of the environment. And I think that we talk a lot about, sharing ideas or speaking up with meetings. And I think that oftentimes this is kind of the most discussed element of psychological safety. And sometimes people really equate psychological safety with speaking up in meetings. Do you agree with this?
To some extent, yes, because it's easy indicator, like how much voices you hear. But I would say it's just one indicator of psychological safety and not everything, It's also important, like what they would say, the content is important. And that will kind of determine which stage of psychological safety your team is. Probably many people have heard of these 4 stages of psychological safety, which I'm going to explain briefly. One is the inclusion safety. Members feel safe belonging to the team. They are comfortable being present, do not feel excluded, and feel like they are wanted and appreciated. So all the members are invited to the meeting and they feel comfortable to be in the meeting. That's inclusion safety. And then there's learner safety. Members are able to learn by asking questions. Members here may be able to experiment and make and admit small mistakes and ask for help. And that can be more challenging than just inclusion safety where you attend a meeting and just say yes, and agree and listening. Because learner safety, you ask questions and sometimes you admit making mistakes and you ask for help. So that's another indicator that there's a higher level of psychological safety. And then there's contributor safety. Members feel safe to contribute their own ideas without fear of embarrassment or ridicule. This is a more challenging state because volunteering your own ideas can increase the psychological vulnerability of team members. So if members start to really share their own ideas, that's the higher level of psychological safety than the previous learner safety. And the 4th stage, which is the highest stage of psychological safety, is the challenger safety. Members can question others, including those in authority, ideas, or suggest significant changes to ideas, plans, or ways of working. So it's very difficult to cultivate this level of psychological safety, challenger safety, especially in countries like Japan or APAC countries where national culture is more status-oriented, more hierarchical. But if this can be cultivated, that can really create great resource for innovative ideas and solutions. So what I want to say is speaking up is, yes, one indicator, but the content of what people are sharing will determine where your team is in terms of these 4 stages of psychological safety. And if people are speaking up and challenging the view of the senior management, then yes, your team has challenger safety, which is the highest level of psychological safety. But if the team members is just agreeing with your senior management opinion, like, yes, that's a good idea. Yes, we are listening. Then yes, it's inclusion safety and there's more to go.
Awesome. So we have inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And for the listeners, I will add some extra resources to this episode, so we'll be able to see that. And I really like how you already mentioned several dimensions of culture. So I want us to dig deeper into that. And I think one of the most common questions that I hear from teams when we talk about cultural differences is this. I often hear that team members from culture X, so it could be Japan, it could be Poland, for example, don't speak up at meetings. Let's talk about how culture impacts that, not speaking up in meetings, or how it could impact that.
Yeah, very good question. And this is a very common theme that I hear, especially from the Westerners, like Americans or Europeans. Like, my team members from Japan don't speak up. I have no idea what they're thinking, or they say yes, but later they disagreed. Like, why didn't say no during the meeting? That's the typical comments I hear. And I'm actually surprised. You said Poland too. Like, does that happen in Poland too? People in Poland don't speak up?
Well, so that depends, right? So for example, I sometimes hear this feedback from the team members, like the leaders that I work with that are from Netherlands or sometimes from the United States. Or I would hear a manager saying that, look, like my team members speak up when we're on the call with other Central European countries, but not necessarily so much when we are on the call with the UK. So there are some dynamics there too.
I see. Okay, it's so relative. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so let me go through some of 5 dimensions briefly and see how those style differences impact the way people speak up or share opinions and what you can do to encourage people to speak up. So the first dimension is independent versus interdependent. And independent or individual, it's an I culture, people value the personal decisions and personal actions, whereas interdependent or group-oriented, people value we, like group consensus and group harmony. So, for example, US is very much on the independent side, Japan is very much on the interdependent side, Poland is somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
And for example, in Japan, so I guess you can go both ways. But Japan is very much on the interdependent side, and the US, being very independent, gets frustrated that people in Japan don't speak up. And there are several factors. One is, definitely the language barrier, which has really nothing to do with cultural styles, because Japanese people have some challenges speaking in English. So that's one factor. But also there's a style differences. Because Japanese culture is more group-oriented, and not just Japan, many Asian countries are more group-oriented, they want to discuss first and build consensus, and then present the opinions as the team opinion. I remember when I facilitated global team building sessions, when the US team member shared his opinion, Japanese member asked him, like, is that your personal opinion or the opinion presenting your team? And the US member was like shocked to get that question. The reason why Japanese members ask that is, in Japan, like, what is the point of sharing your personal opinion? It has no value. You should represent the opinion of a team as a whole. So if you don't have that, don't share. So it's very different priorities. In the US, you're encouraged to share your individual personal opinion. But in countries like Japan or China or Korea, those group-oriented countries, the opinion representing the team is more valued than the personal opinion. So that's one of the reasons why you might not hear personal opinion shared in the meeting, from those cultures, because they're afraid of the impact of what they say to other team members or departments. And often the case, those people do not really share questions too, because they feel like, actually one of the Japanese members said this, I might be the only person who has this question. And I don't want to waste everyone's time by asking this question during the meeting. So I'll stay silent and I will ask questions after the meeting, which really frustrates the US members. Like, why didn't he ask questions during the meeting? So that's kind of a typical dynamic.
So there's a lot of, I'm
Yeah.
just kind of thinking about what is behind this behavior. So it's really care for the group, right? If I present opinions, I want to make sure that I had opportunity to consult my colleagues. And then also I'm not asking questions because I'm mindful of everyone's time. If this is just me, I can check outside of the meeting.
Yeah, so intention is good, but yes, the impact is not necessarily great. So what I do usually when I try to get inputs or when I try to draw out their opinions, especially from those who are more interdependent and group-oriented, what I do are this. First, I incorporate small group discussions like I mentioned before, and then have them report out their opinions as a group. So we don't ask them to share individual opinions, but we ask them to share what came up from this group discussion. So that's one. So they feel more comfortable because it's a group consensus and they can remain anonymous. Another thing that you could do is to allow them to have side conversation in their native language. So this is more advice for the Westerners. Like when you experience long silence from your APAC or sometimes maybe in Poland colleagues, what you could say is, okay, how about we take 5 minutes break? And during the break time, you can discuss this issue with your team members in your own language. And after 5 minutes break, please share with us what has been discussed. And that could allow them to have side discussion that can build consensus, and they can do it in their own language so they can make sure everybody understands, and then they'll share with you their opinions. That usually works very well. Another thing I do is to take a longer break time, especially this works well in a face-to-face meeting. I take a longer break time. Instead of 10 minutes, I take 15 minutes break or even 20 minutes break, and encourage the participants or team members to ask me questions during the break time. And surprisingly, when I ask them, like, do you have any questions? I usually experience silence. But then during the break time, I have like 5 people lining up to ask me questions. So, because they feel like they have more psychological safety to ask questions in one-on-one situation instead of a large group setting. So that's another thing I do.
And as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking that this idea of sharing contributions during a team meeting, brainstorming sessions, this is a technique of getting ideas that is really, really geared towards people who are more independent, right? More individualistic as opposed to people who are more group-oriented.
Yes.
And a lot of times we think that the problem that we're trying to solve is that people don't speak up, but actually the problem is that we don't get contributions from everyone. And
exactly.
And when you reframe it, you have many more options. So then you can do those follow-up meetings and other different things.
Yes, very good point. Yeah, speaking up is just one way to share inputs, but or get contributions. And I really like your way of what is the ultimate goal we want to achieve? And then we could have more ways to achieve that. Yeah.
And because now as we're discussing kind of the impact of culture and you mentioned that we're going to be talking about 5 dimensions of culture, I just want to share with the listeners that we're using a model that is called GlobeSmart from Aperion. And we'll have some links in the additional materials for this episode where you can go and try the tool and see what those dimensions are about. So we discussed the first one, independent and interdependent.
Yeah. And then the next one is egalitarian versus status. So egalitarian means like equal. You perceive everybody equal in a professional setting, whereas status is that you respect the position and the hierarchy in the organization. So people who are egalitarian, country-wise, like US is very much on the egalitarian side. So people from those cultures feel more comfortable to share disagreement with their senior management because everybody's equal in a professional setting. Whereas people in more status-oriented cultures like Japan, China, Korea, India, they respect the position and it's not a good behavior to disagree with their managers. So, definitely that's a link to psychological safety. So when the manager is present in a meeting, the junior members will not share their opinions if their opinions are not the same as their managers. So tips for creating psychological safety in this kind of environment is to, for example, have a focus group interviews, which means that having members with the same organizational level, same hierarchy, discussion share. That's one way. to break this, hierarchical barrier, anonymize their opinions and share with the leaders. Like I sometimes do leader assimilation, where team members can have a very honest opinion feedback to their leaders because all their opinions are anonymized and the leader is not present when the members are having that kind of discussion. So that's another way to get a very honest feedback from junior, younger members in the status-oriented culture. And one more thing I really want to emphasize is that leader sharing their weakness and failures. And so leaders themselves demonstrate the vulnerability and being authentic human being, not the perfect robot, but being very authentic and share their failures and weaknesses, because that will encourage the team members to do the same. And that will lead to team cultures that are less afraid of sharing incomplete ideas, which means more psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. And I think that out of all of the dimensions of culture, I think this is the dimension that produces the most emotions, I feel. And especially when it comes to the status part, hierarchy. And when I work with teams, I often like to think about this dimension as not necessarily as kind of hierarchy or status, but as a structure. Is there a structure to the way the group is organized? And do you have to think about the structure when you want to get contributions from different team members?
Yeah. Structure like system, very important. Yeah. And the third dimension is the dimension which is very important for communication styles. So, direct versus indirect. So people who are direct, like Germans, Americans, I guess Poland is kind of in the middle, but more towards direct compared to Asian, I suppose. So,
yes. If Poles will collaborate with Japanese, we are direct. If Poles collaborate with, let's say, Canadians or US Americans, we are more indirect.
Yeah, very interesting. So people who are direct, they basically, it's also kind of, they're more explicit and they separate what's being said and who said what. Like actually, I remember when I did a team building session with the US, German, and the Japanese members. The Japanese members shared, like they were really surprised that German members had a very heated discussion, like from Japanese point of view, like, oh my God, they're having a fight. But then after that discussion, during the break time, the German colleagues who were just having a very, very, intense debate went out for walk and had lunch together. Like, so from Japanese perspective, how can they be so friendly after having that kind of a very intense debate? Because, from Japanese point of view, we have a very indirect communication style. What's being said and who said that is not separated. So giving a very constructive feedback or an intense debate, it's like attacking that person. So right after that, going to lunch together with smile, it will not happen in Japan. So it's like you're not friend anymore, so to speak. So that's a kind of a stark example of being very direct, like in German's way, and then being very indirect, like Japanese way. And the thing is, indirect members with indirect styles, they're actually sharing disagreement, but in an indirect way, like silence. Or what I often experience with Japanese is that they ask me questions, but it's actually they're sharing with me disagreement or doubt. They say, so Keiko, you said XYZ, but is that really correct? It's like a question, but they're basically saying, I'm not agreeing with your opinion. So they might share the disagreement in the form of questions. Or nonverbal messages like facial expressions or tone of the voice or body gestures. So one of the advice I would like to give, especially people who are more like a Western cultural background, is to have your antenna higher to capture those subtle messages. So don't rely on what you hear only, but open your eyes and try to look at them. Look at those colleagues. So, hopefully you have video camera on and you can look at their facial expressions and you can actually sense that there is something that they have not shared. So maybe I will switch to one-on-one conversation instead of group discussion. So they might share with me what's really bothering them. So that's one advice. Have your antenna higher, switch to one-on-one conversation. And then another thing that you could do is to cultivate trusting relationship with someone who understands both cultures, like you, who understand direct styles and indirect styles, and ask those culture bridge person for their interpretations. Like if it's between German and Japanese teams, German members can find someone, maybe Japanese ideally, who understand both German cultures and the Japanese cultures. It could be interpreter too. And then you can ask those, culture bridge person. So in this meeting, I experienced long silence from the Japanese team. How do you interpret that silence? Is it agreement or disagreement, or they didn't understand what I proposed? What do you think? So you can ask for their interpretations, and that could be one source of information that you can use.
Mm-hmm. I like your metaphor of an antenna. In the first episode of the podcast, I was talking to Satif, my colleague from India, and he also used this metaphor because India is also an indirect communication culture. He said, listen to the music, not just the lyrics. So really paying attention to all of those kind of non-verbal cues as well.
Very good point, yes.
And I want to also kind of highlight for people that are in the leadership positions that we oftentimes if we are more direct, we often pay attention to what we say as leaders, but we miss that if we collaborate with people who are more indirect, sometimes our silence, it's also read into. And I had this situation, I was the head of the learning department and I participated in the leadership development program with a lot of my colleagues. And at the end of the session, the facilitator asked, like, what did you like the most about the program? And I didn't say anything. And then after the session, a colleague of mine who's from Korea came and said, Anna, like your silence shouted. And he thought that I absolutely hated the learning program, which was actually not the case. I just didn't feel that I had anything else kind of to contribute. So this is it's not only what we say, but also what we don't say sometimes is read into.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, very important point. There's lots of meaning. Like in Japan, we say, read the air. There's lots of meaning in the air. Lots of meaning in what's not being said. And of course, we can kind of sense if it's positive or negative silence, but it's hard to interpret the silence in an accurate way, like a Korean colleague of yours interpret your silence in a different way. So that's where culture bridge person can be very useful because that person can give you more accurate interpretation of the silence. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also encourage listeners, if you haven't checked the second episode about communication, we talk about this direct, indirect communication and also low context and high context communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Very important point. Yeah. And then risk uncertainty. So that's kind of, that's a direct dimension that impacts psychological safety. So people who are risk-oriented, like Americans, for example, the US culture is more risk-oriented, probably they feel more comfortable to share new ideas, incomplete ideas, or disagreements because that kind of behavior is encouraged. Do something new. Failure is a part of the learning process. It's easier for people who are risk-oriented to accept that concept. Whereas people who are more certainty-oriented, and Japan is one of the countries that is very, very certainty-oriented, even among Asian countries. We have a proverb called Ishibashi o tataite wataru, which means if you see a stone bridge in front of you, do not cross right away because it could break, 0.0001%. So make sure you hit the stone bridge 3 times. And then if it doesn't break, then you cross. It shows how careful we are in Japan. But anyway, if you have that kind of cultural background, you really do not want to make mistakes or you don't want to share incomplete ideas. You only want to share perfect answers and complete ideas. And that's one of the reasons why Japanese people do not speak up in a meeting because they are afraid of making mistakes and that the psychological safety is low. So what you can do is to provide materials and topics for discussion in advance so those people who are certainty-oriented can prepare and that will lower their fear of being embarrassed and increase the psychological safety. Or you provide data and examples of other companies and you engage them in group discussions, make it anonymous. All of these will lower the hurdle for them to share their opinions and increase psychological safety. And yes, again, what I said before, like show your vulnerability and embrace mistakes. And thank them for sharing what didn't go well and how valuable those are for everyone's learning. I sometimes even make mistakes intentionally, like even facilitators can make a mistake and that will lower hurdle for the participants. Okay, even Keiko made a mistake, so it's okay for me to make a mistake. So sometimes leaders might intentionally make mistakes and really embrace it.
And I think that oftentimes when I work with teams, even when you have people from the same culture, they are going to have a different work styles, right? Connected to this dimension.
Yes.
Of course, here we compare cultures, so kind of the most general patterns. But a lot of times in teams, even with people coming from the same culture, people will have a different work styles around that. And I think that what also helps is really looking at the process and the decision that we make and deciding, okay, in this particular part, we can take risks. But in this one, we might check the bridge 3 times, right? So here we would kind of be a little bit more certainty oriented. And actually, this is also a great way to use our differences for the benefit of the whole team.
Yes, I completely agree, because we need both organization, right? We need risk. We need to take risk. We need speed. We need flexibility. We need innovation, which is, the risk-oriented culture. But we also need reliability, stability, accuracy, and high quality, which often comes from certainty-oriented culture. So you want to have people that has both styles in your organization or teams, and you can really leverage those different strengths that people bring. So I completely agree that we want to have both. And we kind of focus on, we emphasize on one or the other, depending on the outcome that you want to achieve.
Awesome. And then we have, I think, the last dimension of our
custom
5.
relationship. And that kind of relates to the previous episode that you had about building trust, because building trust and relationship through everyday interaction is really critical for building psychological safety. Of course, there are tips that you can use, like I shared before, small group discussion, global English, etc., that you can use in the meeting. But the fundamental piece to build psychological safety is to build trust and relationship through everyday interaction you have in the team. So even though if you are task-oriented or relationship-oriented, the approach to build trust and relationship might be different, but the fact that you have to build trust and relationship is the same. Like, you have to have that in order to have a high level of psychological safety. So that's one thing, like everyday interaction counts. And then what you could do in the meeting or before the meeting is to share the attendance information in advance. So people who are relationship oriented know who are coming, and that will lower the hurdle and increase psychological safety. And also have a relationship building activity at the beginning, some kind of icebreaker that could also increase psychological safety for members to have fun and make mistakes.
So I'm intrigued by this, and I'm thinking about, imagine like this situation, if I were to meet my team that has Japanese team members for the first time as a leader, what would be some ideas for me to kind of do, not even before the meeting, but at the meeting? Like, what kind of questions would be good questions to ask people in terms of this kind of icebreaker?
Like icebreaker? Yeah, one of the things is like what you shared, the similar verb. That's actually good. But one thing I often do is, usually when people are meeting for the first time, they do self-introduction. So I ask them to share something that other people might not know about them. It's kind of built a deeper connection because, for example, I have run a full marathon. So people don't really know that. But when I shared, people will have a deeper understanding of who I am. And that will start to deepen the relationship. So something that people can build relationship on a deeper level than just roles and responsibilities and what they see in the work situation. So that's one thing. And there are a lot of activities, but something that will enhance mutual understanding as a person usually work.
Because usually those things that are unexpected, and by the way, congratulations on running a marathon.
Yeah.
That's great. I think those things that are unexpected are usually connected to our personal life, right?
Exactly.
And this relationship-based trust comes from seeing us also as human beings, not just colleagues, our professional selves.
Exactly.
Great. So we really went deeper into those 5 dimensions. So independent, interdependent, egalitarian status, direct, indirect, risk, certainty, and task and relationships. So I'm thinking about all of the tips that you've shared. And based on your experience and expertise, what do you see people, so especially Westerners or like people from Poland, people from North America, what do we tend to get wrong about working with our colleagues from Japan or other APAC countries?
Yeah, good question. So I guess to kind of summarize what we've been discussing, just because you don't hear much from Japan or APAC countries, colleagues from those countries, it does not mean that they have no opinions or they agree with you completely. It means that there is not enough psychological safety for them to share their real opinions. So implementing some of the tips and strategies that we have explored, you will start to hear more from them. It might not take the form of speaking up. It could take the form of sharing opinions via chat or sharing the information in different format. But if you build more psychological safety, you'll start to hear more from them. So don't just equate speaking up or silence with their intelligence or their competence.
Yes, I love that. And I think that the more I'm having those conversations, the more clear it becomes to me that oftentimes it's usually never the behavior that is a problem, but it's always our interpretation of it. And here, if you don't hear from someone, you go to this idea of, okay, they have nothing to contribute, right? Which almost never is the case.
Yeah. And one more thing maybe I'll add. It's not just the Westerners who need to adjust their, styles and how they interpret. When I do a lot of training for the Japan and APAC members, I often encourage them to speak up. Like, do not expect your Western colleagues to read between the lines and assume your expectations or intention without you speaking up. Yeah, so behavior adjustment should come from both sides. So yes, Westerners need to have antenna higher and listen more carefully and have multiple means of communication open. But also, Japan and APAC colleagues need to speak up. Don't be afraid of making mistakes because Westerners don't take them personally. So feel more comfortable to take risk and speak up. So both styles need to adjust.
And I think that's a wonderful note to finish the conversation on, that it's always about the adjustments of the both sides. Keiko, I like to ask this question towards the end of my conversation. What was the most valuable part of it for you?
Yeah, there's one thing I also want to share, which I haven't talked before. The thing is that sometimes people misunderstand psychological safety with being friends with my colleagues, holding hand and everybody's happy and so forth. They will say that I cannot give negative feedback to my colleague because that would hurt the person and damage psychological safety. And that is not correct. Creating psychological safety is not the ultimate goal. The goal is to build a high-performing team where the team members, each of the team members realize their full potential. They really thrive and the team performance goes up, like it's very high. So that's the ultimate goal. And psychological safety is one of the enablers to do that, like the Google Aristotle project that Google found out. So psychological safety and high team performance go together. Psychological safety is not sacrificing team performance. I hope that makes sense. So that's one thing that some people tend to get wrong. So I want to really emphasize that point.
Yeah, so the goal is team effectiveness, and kind of what gets us there is psychological safety.
Exactly.
But also, I think, high performance standards, right? Only when those two are together, we have learning and we have high performing organization.
Yes, exactly.
I love that you added this misconception. So psychological safety does not equate niceness and not giving feedback, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's to be able to give constructive feedback without the fear of being rejected. So it does not mean that you just only give nice feedback. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the last question, the value. Honestly, to prepare for this podcast, I did a lot of research on psychological safety, looked back at my career and what I do at work. So if you didn't give me this opportunity, I would never have really analyzed psychological safety from various angles. So I really appreciate you invited me for this conversation. And, even from the preparation stage, it was very valuable for me to look at psychological safety from various angles, and having conversation with you really helped me see psychological safety, like why we need it and how to cultivate it and why it's important and what is psychological safety and what is no psychological safety. So all these things became much clearer after having conversation with you. So I really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for me, I think I'm thinking about myself. I'm very risk oriented. So I really need to be mindful when I have conversations with others where I design or facilitate. And for me, talking to you and learning, especially those very specific things that would work for people who are, for example, more certainty oriented, more group oriented, and just discussing how psychological safety can be sometimes misunderstood is super, super helpful. And I'm sure for the listeners, it's going to be also very, very helpful. So thank you so much, Keiko, for the conversation and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening. And I invite you to the next episode of the podcast that will come out in a month. And for now, I'll keep the topic top secret.